Old Testament and the New Man, Genesis through Joshua with Dr. Daniel Cantey. As the modern order enters its apparent sunset, Dr. Cantey looks anew at the ancient scriptures to learn what they teach about man and his world. Here he is with today's episode.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Old Testament and the New Man. I'm Daniel Cantey, and in this particular episode, we're going to be shifting from the patriarchal narrative that we just finished in Genesis and shifting to the national narrative. Now, these are the two phases that are a part of the big story of the creation of Israel. And one of the main questions that we're asking in this course is, how does God create? So we see him creating through the patriarchs, which is basically the story of a family, albeit a growing one. And then when we shift from the end of Genesis with the story of Joseph into Exodus with the story of Moses and the Israelites, we're now talking about what we would conceivably call a nation as opposed to a family, because we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people as opposed to a large family. So we're making that shift from phase one of the story into phase two of the story. Now, as we begin with the Exodus, I want to say that I think the Exodus is probably the most misunderstood biblical story in our day. That many Americans have a concept of the story of the Exodus, but their concept of the story is not quite right. They're missing the point of the internal workings of this story. Now, when I've taught this story in the past, I would begin by asking the students, tell me the story of the Exodus, because most of them have heard it at one point or another. And they would give me a general outline of the story. And I want to give that general outline of the story to you. And let me say here before I go on any farther, that I have a little bit of a cough, and so you may hear a little bit of that here and there. Please be patient with me. But let's begin with the story of the Exodus as it is told to me, and as it has been told to me by students, and as I think it is characteristically held in the American mind these days. So, how does the story of the Exodus go? Well, the Israelites are enslaved in Egypt, and this is very bad, and it's really awful treatment that they have under the Egyptians, and they're crying out to God that God would come and save them. And as this is happening, the Pharaoh gives an edict that all of the male children that are born are to be thrown into the Nile or are to be killed, essentially. And so at this point, Moses is born. And Moses is saved. His mother hides him, he's put in the basket in the Nile River, and the daughter of the Pharaoh finds him. And he ends up being raised in the house of the Pharaoh. And so after being raised in the house of the Pharaoh, Moses has to leave. He leaves Egypt. While he is gone, he encounters God at the burning bush. And God says to him, I have heard the cries of my people in Egypt. I'm going to free them. I want you to be the one who goes to free them. And Moses is a little bit reluctant about this, so he ends up going with his brother Aaron. And the two of them go back to Egypt, and they go to Pharaoh and they say, thus says the God of Israel, let my people go, meaning free the slaves. And so when Pharaoh hears this, he says, who is the God of Israel? I don't know him. No, I'm not going to let them go. And at the same time, Pharaoh also says, you Israelites have been making bricks for us Egyptians, and we've been giving you the straw for these bricks, but we're not going to do that anymore. Now you have to make your own bricks with your own straw that you have gathered. And so this makes things worse for the Israelites. And the Israelites are crying out under their burdens at this point. And it's after this initial rejection that God sends the plagues. And there are 10 of these plagues. Things like frogs, boils, flies, all these kinds of awful natural disasters that are now afflicting the Egyptians. And the last one of these is the death of the firstborn. And so God says to Moses, go and tell Pharaoh that the angel of death is going to come through the land of Egypt and will strike down all of the firstborn in Egypt. While at the same time, the Israelites are told to sacrifice the paschal lamb and put the blood of the lamb on the doorposts. And this will signal to the angel of death that it should pass over and not kill the firstborn in that house. And it's after this particular plague that Pharaoh will say, I've had enough. you Israelites can go. And he will let them go. He will free the slaves. And so this happens. The angel of death goes through. The Israelites do end up leaving Egypt afterwards, but Pharaoh changes his mind after the Israelites have been let go, and so he decides to pursue them with his army. And it's at this point, when the Israelites approach the Red Sea, that God says to Moses, hold your hands out over the waters, and they will divide. And the waters divide, and the Israelites actually walk through the Red Sea with the waters divided or gathered up, as it were, on their left and on their right. They walk through on dry land, and they are saved. While when the Egyptians are in the middle of the Red Sea, following them in this path through the waters actually crash down on the Egyptians, and the Egyptian army is wiped out. And it's after this that the Israelites are truly free. And this is the story of the Exodus as it has been told to me, again, by students. Now, I want to say, and some of you may be surprised to hear, that there's something wrong with this story. And some of you will have heard this story since the time that you were 5 years old or something, since you were a little child. If you've heard it in the way that I just told it, there's a significant detail that is in error. There's a significant detail that is wrong in what has been said. And so as we go through the story here, as I walk through the chapters, we will see what in fact is wrong with that rendition. And I have heard this misconception from both non-Orthodox people that I have taught, as well as Orthodox people who have the same version of the story, the kind of Americanized version or the contemporary version in their mind, that all of them have a misunderstanding or have had a misunderstanding of how this story actually works and what is being said, what is being emphasized, and why it is being emphasized. And so let's listen closely to the story as we go through it. So we begin with the Israelites being a large number of people. This is chapter 1, verse 7. Joseph died, as well as all his brothers and all that generation. Then the children of Israel increased and multiplied. Verse 7. They became numerous and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. So there's a whole lot of Israelites around, not just a family anymore. But there arose a new king, over Egypt, who knew not Joseph. Then he said to his nation, look, the race of the children of Israel is a great multitude and is stronger than we. Come, let us outwit them, lest they multiply. And it happen in the event of war that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so escape out of the land. Now the Hebrew text says, let us deal wisely with them. The Septuagint says, let us outwit them. But the spirit here is essentially the same. Let us be wiser than the Israelites. Lest they multiply, they join our enemies, and ultimately, lest they escape out of the land. Now, here's a question for everybody listening. What are the Israelites going to do at the end of this story? That's right. They are going to escape out of the land. So we have the Egyptians planning on a course of action. And we're going to see what that course of action is here in a minute. But they're planning on a course of action that's going to bring about the opposite of what they want. And this is something we've already seen. We already saw this, for example, in the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve want to be more like God, they eat the fruit, and then they end up being less like God, because now they die. Or, for example, in the story of the Tower of Babel, where the people don't want to be scattered, and so they build a tower to the heavens, and what ends up happening? They end up getting scattered. So when you follow a course of sin, you end up with the opposite of what it is that you desire. We've already seen that twice. We're going to see it here a third time. So let's see what exactly is the course that the Egyptians decide to follow, this course that's going to lead to the opposite of what they actually desire. Pharaoh therefore set taskmasters over the Israelites to afflict them in their works. And they built for Pharaoh strong cities, Pithom and Ramses and On, which is Heliopolis. But the more they humbled the Israelites, the more they multiplied and grew. And the Egyptians greatly abhorred the children of Israel. So the Egyptians tyrannized the children of Israel by force. They made their lives bitter with hard labor, in mortar, in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their labor in which they made them serve was by violence. And it's clear here that the Israelites have been enslaved by the Egyptians. But it's important to understand that this is more than just slavery. The Egyptians tyrannized the children of Israel by force. They made their lives bitter with hard labor. They made them serve by violence. The Hebrew text here says that the Egyptians ruthlessly oppressed the Israelites. Again, this is more than just slavery. This is slavery intensified. And to provide a kind of good contrast here, Joseph was a slave for much of the story that we saw in Genesis, but at no point was he tyrannized by his masters in terms of his workload, nor was he made to serve by violence, nor was his life bitter with hard labor. None of those things apply to Joseph. And in the biblical outlook, you have slavery, which is not really approved of, but is tolerated. And then you have what is happening here, which is, again, to use the phrase of the Hebrew text, ruthless oppression, tyrannizing by force in this particular text here in the Septuagint. So we have something worse than slavery as an institution, according to the Old Testament mind. Not only do these people not have freedom, but they are now being brutally oppressed in terms of their workload and the violence that is being imposed upon them. Now it's at this point the king of the Egyptians spoke to the Hebrew midwives, and he said, "When you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women, and see they are about to give birth, if it is a male, you shall kill him, but if a female, let her live." But the midwives, for those of you who know the story, are not obedient, and they decide that they're going to let the males live instead, and this makes the Pharaoh kind of angry. But God, seeing what the midwives have done, deals well with them, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. So it was because the midwives feared God, he provided households for them. And it's at this time that Moses is born. And his mother hides him for the first 3 months, but when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes, daubed it with asphalt, and put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister was watching him while he was in the river. But then the daughter of Pharaoh comes down to the river, and lo and behold, she sees the ark that Moses is in. And she finds out that his sister is there. And they call the child's mother, Moses' mom. And Moses' daughter then said to the mother of Moses, "Take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And when the boy Moses was grown, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So Moses, as an Israelite, grows up in the house of the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh's daughter calls his name Moses, saying, "Because I drew him out of water." So the name Moses means to be drawn out of water. And this is a foreshadowing in his name of how it is that Israel is created. They are going to be drawn out of the waters through the Red Sea later on in this story. But more than that, all of creation, if we go back to Genesis 1, comes out of the waters. Before the first day, the Spirit of God hovered over the waters, and the waters, therefore, are a kind of womb for creation. Life will come out of them. And Moses, as the one who is drawn out of water, this becomes a kind of sign that he is the one through whom God will create Israel and make them his people. Now Moses, when he is of age, he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he sees the burdens of the Israelites, and he commiserates with them. He must know that he is an Israelite at this point. But when he sees the Egyptian beating the Hebrew, he kills the Egyptian, thinking that no one sees what he has done. Then the next day, after killing the Egyptian and hiding the body, he goes out and he sees 2 Hebrew men fighting. And he says to the one who has done the wrong, who did the wrong, "Why are you hitting your neighbor?" And the man says back to Moses, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" And so this bothers Moses. He knows that his murder of the Egyptian taskmaster is known, and so he's got to get out of town. And in fact, when Pharaoh hears of what Moses has done, he seeks to kill him, and so Moses has to flee. At this point, Moses goes to Midian. There he meets his father-in-law, the man who would become his father-in-law, Jethro. He marries Zipporah, and he has a son named Gershom. And so he's getting on with life, as it were, outside of Egypt. Then the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel groaned because of their labors, and they cried out. And their cry came up to God because of their labors, and he heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is the prelude to God meeting Moses in chapter 3 in the burning bush. So Moses comes to Horeb, the mountain of God, one day while he is in Midian. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he saw the bush burning with fire, and the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not consumed. And this is the first theophany, that is, an appearance of God to man in a quasi-physical form through physical realities. And it is a bush that is burning and is not consumed. Now, there's really not anything unusual about a bush being on fire, because we expect the bush that is on fire to be consumed, to be in the process of dying. But this bush, though it is on fire and should be in the process of dying, is living through death. If you think about what it means in terms of the experience to see this, it's to say, oh, well, there's a bush that's on fire. You expect it to be becoming charred, to see the leaves wilting, to see everything burning up. But Moses does not see what he expects to see. He sees life through death, life persisting on the other side of death, as it were. And so this initial theophany, this encounter of Moses with God, is in fact reminiscent for us of the meaning of resurrection, to die and to live through death. Already we see this present, at least in a kind of veiled form. When therefore the Lord saw him turn aside and look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. Then he said, Here I am. So God said, Do not come any closer. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And then the Lord said, Indeed, I have seen the affliction of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrow. Come now, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt, and to bring them into another land, a land flowing with milk and honey. But Moses said to God, Who am I to go to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to bring the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt? Then God says to him, I will be with you. And these are the same words, by the way, that we saw with the patriarchs in the book of Genesis. We saw it with Isaac. We saw it with Joseph. God is with them. In the same way, God is with Moses. And Moses said to God, this is verse 13, Indeed, when I go to the children of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I tell them? Then God said to Moses, I am the existing one. He also said, Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, The existing one sent me to you. And it's at this point, as we meditate on the name of God, that we're going to let St. Augustine speak to us on this particular verse, chapter 3, verse 14. But now the Lord speaks to Moses, says St. Augustine. I am who I am, he who is sent me. When he asked God's name, you see, this is what was said, I am who I am. And you shall say to the children of Israel, He who is sent me to you. What's this all about? O God, O Lord of ours, what are you called? I am called He is, he said. What does it mean I am called He is? That I abide forever, that I cannot change. Things which change are not, because they do not last. What is, abides. But whatever changes was something and will be something. Yet you cannot say it is, because it is changeable. So the unchangeableness of God was prepared to suggest itself by this phrase, I am who I am. And so St. Augustine teaches us that when Moses encounters God and asks for his name, he is met with the eternal unchangeableness of God. Whereas we are surrounded in this earth by things that are constantly changing, things that are constantly moving and in flux, God as he who is, as one who is one who does not change, as one who we later know as love, a love that does not change. And so God's immutability stands before us, that he is the one who does not change. And in this context of his covenant, he is the one who is faithful to his covenant and will act in that faithfulness to bring his people out of Egypt. God says to Moses, "Go then and gather the elders of the children of Israel together and say to them, 'The Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, appeared to me, saying, I have surely looked upon you and all the things that happened to you in Egypt, and I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, to a land flowing with milk and honey.'" So Moses is to take the promise from God to the elders of Israel and tell them what is about to happen, that God is about to liberate them. Verse 18 of chapter 3. "Then they will heed your voice, and you shall go, you and the elders of Israel, to the king of Egypt. You shall say to him, 'The God of the Hebrews met with us, and now let us go 3 days' journey into the desert to sacrifice to God.'" Now, again, what is it that they say when they go to the Pharaoh? "The God of the Hebrews met with us, and now let us go a 3 days' journey into the desert to sacrifice to our God." If they go to Pharaoh and they say, "Let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness to sacrifice to our God," what are they not saying? They're not saying, "Let us go," as in free the slaves. That's not the request. Now, some of you have grown up thinking, a la Charlton Heston or whatever other movies have been made about this, that Moses and Aaron go and they say, "Let my people go. This is what God says, free the slaves." That's not what Moses and Aaron say. At no point when they go to Pharaoh do they say, "Free the slaves." At every point they say, "Let us go and have a feast to our God in the wilderness," or "Let us go and have a 3 days' journey into the wilderness to make sacrifice to our God." So if God is going to free them, and this is a story about freedom, God is clearly going to free his people. That's his point all along. That's very clear. So if that's the case, why is it that instead of asking for freedom, they ask for a 3 days' journey into the wilderness to make sacrifice? Now we're going to come back to this question. We'll see in just a moment here why it is that they ask this question and not the other one, or why it is that they say, "Let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness," as opposed to saying, "Let my people go," i.e. free the slaves. So God, continuing on here, God promises to the elders of Israel through Moses, "I know the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, will not let you go, not even by a mighty hand. Thus I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all my wonders, which I will work among them. And after that he will let you go. And when you go, you shall not go empty-handed, but you shall take articles of gold, silver, and clothing. Thus you shall plunder the Egyptians." Now already here it's kind of written into the story that when they leave, they're not just going to sacrifice. And yet the request is that they go and sacrifice. Now in chapter 4, Moses is given additional miracles by which he will be able to attest the fact that he is from God. So he'll throw his staff on the ground and it turns into a snake. Or he puts his hand in his bosom and he brings it out and it's leprous. Or he takes water from the river and he pours it on the land and the water becomes blood. These are signs that he's given. He still doesn't really want to go himself, and so Aaron, his brother, ends up going with him. And God says, "I will open your mouth and his mouth." And so the two of them will go before Pharaoh together. So Moses and Aaron together now go back to Egypt. And they go to the Israelites, and they perform the signs before the Israelites. And the Lord said to Moses, "When you go back to Egypt, see that you work before Pharaoh all the wonders I put in your hand, but I will harden his heart, and he will not let you go." And by the way, this understanding or the question of what it means for Pharaoh to have his heart hardened, this just means that the divine permission allows Pharaoh to act according to his own free choice against God. So Pharaoh's heart being hardened is actually a term for Pharaoh's heart being strengthened against God, which is Pharaoh's natural inclination, as it were. So this is a kind of permission for Pharaoh to go his own way. So the heart of Pharaoh will be hardened. Chapter 4, verse 22, God says to Moses, "Then you shall say to Pharaoh, 'Thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. So I say to you, let my people go so that they may serve me. But if you refuse to let them go, indeed I will kill your firstborn son.'" And here, interestingly, in chapter 4, we have a foreshadowing of the logic of the last plague. God says to Pharaoh, "You deny me my firstborn son, therefore I will kill your firstborn son." This is another instance of something that we saw in Genesis, which is the inverse of the golden rule. What you do will be done back to you. We saw this in the story of Joseph when the brothers were in anguish as they were trying to get grain, and Simeon, their brother, has been taken by Joseph and put in jail while the rest of the brothers go back to Canaan. And they say, "We saw the boy's anguish and we did nothing to help him. This is why this anguish has come on to us," they say. What we did is being done back to us. And here that same principle is at work. Why is it that God kills the firstborn? Why is this the ultimate plague? Well, it is what Pharaoh has chosen for himself by his own actions. Because what he does in effectively trying to kill the child of God by removing it from God so that God cannot have his firstborn son, what he does brings upon him the same action, that it is his firstborn son, the Pharaoh's firstborn son, as well as the firstborn sons of all of the children of Egypt, of all the people of Egypt, I should say, that will be killed. So Moses and Aaron went and gathered the elders of the children of Israel together. They do all the signs. And the people believed and rejoiced because God had visited the children of Israel and because he had seen their affliction. Then the people bowed and worshiped. Now this takes us to chapter 5, which is one of the key chapters in this story when Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh. And we will learn in this chapter what is really going on at the heart of this story and what really is happening here. Chapter 5, verse 1. "Now after this, Moses and Aaron went and spoke to Pharaoh. 'Thus says the Lord God of Israel, let my people go, so they may hold a feast to me in the desert.' Then Pharaoh said, 'Who is he, that I should obey this God's voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go.' So they said, 'The God of the Hebrews has called us to him. Let us go 3 days' journey into the desert and sacrifice to the Lord our God, lest at any time death or slaughter happen to us.' Then the king of Egypt said to them, 'Why, Moses and Aaron, do you take the people from their work? Get back to your work.' And again Pharaoh said, 'Look, the people of the land are many now, so let us not give them rest from their work.'" When Moses and Aaron go to the Pharaoh and they ask for a 3 days journey into the wilderness to make sacrifice, they are not asking for freedom. Freedom is not what is holy. They are asking for rest. They are asking for rest from their labors physically, and they are asking for rest in God in the sacrifice. Rest from their sins, rest for their salvation. They're asking for both a physical and a spiritual rest. They are asking for what is holy. And Pharaoh sees this right off. Pharaoh's answer is, no, get back to your work. In fact, later on, after Pharaoh tells them that you're now going to make bricks without straw, he says to the clerks of the Israelites, he says to them, you are loafers. Therefore you say, let us go and sacrifice to the Lord. Now therefore go and work. No straw shall be given you, yet you shall deliver the quota of bricks." Throughout this key chapter, the dichotomy is not freedom and slavery. The dichotomy is not Moses and Aaron going to Pharaoh and saying, let my children go. And Pharaoh says, no, I don't believe in freedom for you all. I'm going to keep you as slaves. That's not what's happening here. What's happening is that Moses and Aaron go and ask for rest. And Pharaoh consistently says, no, I'm not going to give you rest. Get back to your work. Now, it's important to note that these are the same themes, the same basic themes that we saw in Genesis 1. God works for 6 days, and then he rests. And we saw it in Genesis 2, work and rest with Adam and Eve. They provide rest for one another. They have a joint task with one another. And here again in Exodus, a story of creation, really, this is one of the primal stories of the creation of Israel as a nation. The major themes are work and rest. And some people think, I've heard the interpretation out there, that, well, Moses and Aaron are being tricksters, and God is being a trickster. He's asking for something small when he knows he wants something large. Moses and Aaron go and they say, let us have a 3 days journey into the wilderness, when really all along they're just planning to leave and not come back. And I don't believe that interpretation is correct, because the themes of work and rest, which we see here, we see in other critical places in the scriptures. And so work and rest as the basic categories should shape our understanding of this story. Because what is being denied is not freedom, not directly. What is being denied is rest. Rest in God, rest from one's labors. And it's at this point, after the children of Israel are told that they have to make bricks with no straw, that their spirits are broken. They departed from Pharaoh and they met Moses and Aaron, who stood there to meet them. And these, again, are the elders of Israel here. They said to them, "Let the Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us abhorrent in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, to put a sword in his hand to kill us." So things are very bad at this point for the Israelites. Their rest has been denied. The tyranny, the serving by violence that they have been subjected to, has gotten even worse than it was before. And they say, this is as it were to kill us through the Egyptians. So Moses returned to the Lord, presumably in prayer, and he says, "O Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Why is it you sent me?" And we're told by the fathers that Moses does not say this out of exasperation. He says it out of humility and genuine curiosity. Why have things turned out this way? From the time I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has afflicted this people. Neither have you delivered your people at all. The people have been lowered more than they were even before. When shall they be raised up? And it's at this point, at the beginning of chapter 6, that God says to Moses, effectively, get out of the way, it's my turn. Now you shall see, he says, what I will do to Pharaoh. For with a strong hand he will let them go, and with a strong hand he will drive them from this land. I have also heard the groaning of the children of Israel, whom the Egyptians keep in bondage, and I remembered my covenant. I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the Egyptian tyranny. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. Then you shall know that I am the Lord who brought you out from under the Egyptian tyranny. I will bring you into the land I swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so Moses and Aaron go to the people, and they tell them, God is going to act. He is going to work for you. But they paid no heed to Moses because of their faint-heartedness and their cruel bondage. So at this point, their spirits are broken. They are utterly without rest. And it is at this point that God acts. Chapter 7, verse 1. Now the Lord said to Moses, "See, I have made you a god to Pharaoh, and Aaron your brother shall be your prophet. I will harden Pharaoh's heart and multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. My people, the children of Israel, I will bring out of the land of Egypt with my power and great vengeance. Then all the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord." And at this point, the plagues begin here in the middle of chapter 7. God tells Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and say, 'The Lord God of the Hebrews has sent me to you, saying, let my people go to serve me in the desert.' But you would not hear. And so the first plague will occur. Behold, I will strike the water in the river with the rod in my hand, and it shall be turned to blood. And there shall be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in the vessels of wood and of stone." And so Moses does this, and the Egyptians with their sorcerers do the same thing, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not heed them, as the Lord said. The second plague is the plague of frogs. Thus says the Lord through Moses, "Let my people go to serve me. But if you refuse to let them go, behold, I will smite all your territory with frogs." And Aaron stretches out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs come up, and they cover the land of Egypt. The third plague is lice. The fourth is flies. The 5th is the plague of diseased cattle. The 6th is the plague of boils. The 7th is the plague of hail. At each point, Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh and they say, "Let my people go so that they may serve me." Throughout this, the request is, let my people go to the wilderness to sacrifice. It is, give my people rest. That is the request that over and over is being denied. After the plague of hail is the plague of locusts. And it's in the middle of this particular plague that we see a certain development happening. Now, momentum is building through this story. Things are getting worse and worse for the Pharaoh. At some point, it would seem, he is going to expel the Israelites out of this land, and they don't have to come back. Things will get that bad for him. At the same time, there is a discussion here during this plague of the locusts where Moses and Aaron are pretty firm about what is going to go with them when they leave. This is chapter 10, verse 7. Pharaoh's servants said to him, "How long shall this man be a snare to us? Let the men go so they may serve their God. Do you not yet know Egypt is destroyed?" So Moses and Aaron were brought again to Pharaoh, and he said to them, "Go serve the Lord your God. But who are the ones going?" And Moses replied, "We will go with our young and our old, with our sons and daughters, with our sheep and oxen, for we must hold a feast to the Lord." Then he said to them, "Let the Lord be with you when I let you and your little ones go, but not your belongings," said the Pharaoh, "for evil lies before you." In other words, Pharaoh does not trust Moses and Aaron that they are in fact going to come back. "Not so, but let the men go and serve God, for that is what you desired." But then Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and he does not let them go. Now, it's really interesting to think in the middle of this story about counterfactuals. So Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh, and they ask several times at this point, "Let us go to worship our God. Give us a 3-day journey into the wilderness to make sacrifice." What happens if Pharaoh says yes? Imagine for a moment that he doesn't keep hardening his heart, and at some point he says yes, and he lets them go, and he gives them rest. Well, what happens after that? According to the story, they would come back. They got the rest that they needed. Now it's understood that they are supposed to have rest. But it's the denial of rest that precipitates the movement towards freedom. What is it that, as it were, kickstarts their move towards freedom, that transforms at some point from a desire for a small freedom, that is, a 3-day journey into the wilderness that would presumably end with them going back, right? The request for a small freedom that transforms into a larger freedom, a freedom that is liberation because they're not going back to be under their law. It is the continued denial of rest that brings about this transition so that rest itself is transformed into something much broader, something much wider, something much more total, we might say, a radical change in life. You were a slave under a particular law, but at the end of this, after your rest has been denied over and over and over again, you will no longer be subject to that law. You will be spat out, as it were, from those who held you under that law. The 9th plague is the plague of darkness. There was darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness that may be felt. The children of Israel had light in their dwellings, not so for the Egyptians. Then Pharaoh called to Moses and said, "Go serve the Lord your God. Only let your sheep and your oxen be kept back. Let your belongings also go with you." So this is their second argument about what the Israelites are going to take with them. But Moses said, "No, you must give us whole burnt offerings and sacrifices that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Thus our cattle shall go with us, not a hoof shall be left behind." Then the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let them go. And Pharaoh said, "Depart from me. Take heed to yourself that you see my face no more, for in the day you see my face you shall die." And Moses said, "You have spoken well. I will never see your face again." And it's at this point in chapter 11, the beginning of the 10th plague, that the death of the firstborn is announced. God says to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to let everyone ask from his neighbor articles of silver and gold and clothing, So the Lord gave the people grace in the sight of the Egyptians, and they lent to them. And the man Moses was very great before the Egyptians and before Pharaoh and all his servants. And Moses said to Pharaoh, Thus says the Lord, At about midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the female servant behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And in this way the Lord shall make a wide distinction between the Egyptians and Israel. The Lord, after Pharaoh heard this, hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the children of Israel depart from the land. At this point, the Lord talks to Moses and institutes the festival of Passover. He tells Moses to speak to the people of Israel. On the 10th day of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb, according to the family households, a lamb for each home. You shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. They shall eat the flesh on that night roasted in fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall eat it. Thus you shall eat it with a belt on your waist, with your sandals on your feet, and with your staff in your hand. You shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Pascha. St. Augustine tells us again, we're going to let him speak to us about the blood being put on the doorpost. This is chapter 12, verse 7. And I quote, For why would the Lord instruct them to kill a sheep on this very feast day, except that it was about he whom it was prophesied, as a sheep is led to the slaughter? So St. Augustine looks forward to Christ in this particular verse. He continues, The doorposts of the Jews were marked with the blood of a slaughtered animal. Our foreheads are marked with the blood of Christ. And that sign, because it was a sign, was said to keep the destroyer away from the houses marked with the sign. The sign of Christ drives the destroyer away from us, insofar as our heart receives the Savior. And so just as the Israelites put the sign on their doorposts, we have the sign of Christ on our foreheads and in our heart. And so we are saved from the destroyer of our souls. And this Pascha looks forward to that Pascha for the entire world, Christ who is sacrificed for us. God says, continuing on with the story, Against all the gods of Egypt I will execute vengeance. I am the Lord. And when I see the blood on the doorposts, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. And you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation, and on the 7th day there shall be a holy convocation for you. No servile work shall be done on them. So on those days, no servile work shall be done, and in between them unleavened bread shall be eaten. Verse 21 of chapter 12, Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, Go away and take a lamb for yourselves according to your families, and sacrifice the Pascha. St. John Chrysostom says, speaking on this verse, and I quote here, What then did Moses do? Sacrifice an unblemished lamb, he said, and smear your doors with its blood. What do you mean? Can the blood of an irrational animal save one who expresses reason? Yes, he says, not because it is blood, but because it prefigures the master's blood. Although statues of the emperor have neither life nor perception, they can save the men endowed with perception and life who flee to them for refuge, not because they are bronze, but because they are images of the emperor. And to step away for just a moment here, St. John is talking about the practice of those who were in some sort of trouble running to statues of the emperor and clinging to them as a way of guarding their lives in the ancient world. Continuing on with what he says, So too that blood which lacked life and perception saved the men who had life, not because it was blood, but because it was an anticipatory type of the master's blood. And so here again, we see the fathers looking at the Egyptian Pascha and seeing the Pascha of Christ and its saving sacrifice for those who would like to have eternal rest with the Father, eternal rest with God. Continuing on with the story, when the angel of death sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass by the door and not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to strike you. You shall observe this thing, the Israelites are told, as an ordinance for you and your children forever. So if you enter the land the Lord shall give you, as he promised, you shall keep this service. Thus it shall be, when your children say to you, what does this service mean? That you shall say, this is the paschal sacrifice of the Lord. And so that night, the angel of death passes through the land of Egypt, and all of the firstborn of the land of Egypt are killed. And there was a great cry in all the land of Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. Then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, rise, go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel. Go and serve the Lord as you said. Take also your sheep and oxen and go, and bless me as well. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, having their kneading bowls bound up in their clothes on their shoulders. And they took articles of silver, gold, and clothing from the Egyptians. Thus they plundered the Egyptians, and they leave, never to return. As they are outside of the control of Pharaoh, not yet having passed through the Red Sea, they are led by the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire as they are moving across the desert. God led them by day in a pillar of cloud to show them the way, and by night in a pillar of fire. And thus the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before all the people. And not long after they have left, Pharaoh's heart is hardened again, and he decides that he will pursue them. He decides that he will come after them. His people come to him and they say, why have we done this, that we have let Israel go from serving us? And so Pharaoh took 600 choice chariots and all the chariots of Egypt with captains over every one of them, and he went and pursued the children of Israel. And when the children of Israel look back and they see the Egyptians pursuing them, they say to Moses, is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the desert? But Moses said, the Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. And it's at this point, as they are facing the Red Sea, that God tells Moses, lift up your rod and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, and let the children of Israel go on dry ground through the midst of the sea. I indeed will harden Pharaoh's heart, God says, and all the Egyptians, and they will go in after them. So I will be glorified in Pharaoh and over all his army. So Moses stretched out his hand, and the Lord carried back the sea by a strong south wind all that night and made the sea dry ground, and the waters were divided. And the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on the dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on their right and on their left, and they passed through the sea. And then the Egyptians pursued and went after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and horsemen. But God troubled the army of the Egyptians, and he bound the axles of their chariot wheels and caused them to proceed with difficulty. And so the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so the waters may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and upon their riders. And so Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and when the morning appeared, the sea returned to its full depth, while the Egyptians were trying to flee. But the Lord shook off the Egyptians in the midst of the sea, and the waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all of Pharaoh's army that came into the sea after them. Not so much as one of them remained. And here St. Gregory of Nyssa speaks to us. He says, and I quote, again, according to the view of the inspired Paul, the people itself, by passing through the Red Sea, proclaimed the good tidings of salvation by water. The people passed over, and the Egyptian king with his host was engulfed. And by these actions, this sacrament, that is, the sacrament of baptism, was foretold. For even now, whensoever the people is in the water of regeneration, fleeing from Egypt from the burden of sin, it is set free and saved. But the devil with his own servants, I mean, of course, the spirits of evil, is choked with grief and perishes, deeming the salvation of men to be his own misfortune. And so the waters are divided, but for one people, this is birth and life and rescue, a beginning. For another people, it is destruction and death and the end of their pride, the end of the pride of Pharaoh, his destruction in the Red Sea, the exaltation of the Israelites who were humbled, as they begin a new life, a new existence as God's people, a new direction towards the land that he has set aside for them. Moses and the children of Israel sing a song. Let us sing to the Lord, for he is greatly glorified. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord became my helper and the shield of my salvation. He is my God, and I will glorify him, my Father's God, and I will exalt him. This is chapter 15, verse 13. In your righteousness you guided your people whom you redeemed, they sang. In strength you called them to your holy resting place. In verse 17, bring in your people and plant them in the mountain of their inheritance, in your prepared habitation, O Lord, which your hands made ready, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands established. And so when we look at the song that the Israelites sing after the Egyptian army has been destroyed in the waters, we see that God has saved them, that they are liberated, they are freed from their captors, those who tyrannized them, those who ruthlessly oppressed them. They have now been released from that burden, from that bondage. But they are released for the purpose of going to their resting place. God has called them to the promised land. That is where they are going. They are to be planted in the prepared habitation that the Lord would have for them, which his hands had made ready, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. So this story of the Exodus is not an end in itself. It is not the fullness of salvation. It is a birth, like baptism, towards salvation. It is a birth, like baptism, towards the place of rest for which the Israelites are destined. It is not the beginning and the end, but a starting point, and a very critical one at that. The Israelites were denied their rest. They were denied what is holy. And the intensification of that denial and the pressure placed on the Pharaoh by his own denial transformed that request for rest into the expulsion from their slavery that is freedom. Thank you.
The Old Testament and the New Man, Genesis through Joshua with Dr. Daniel Cantey. Dr. Cantey taught religion and philosophy at Bethel University from 2012 to 2019. He is a graduate of Yale Divinity School and Emory University and lives with his family in Clarksville, Tennessee. This has been a listener and viewer-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.